In this video, I want to conclude some of the major tenets of Fregean semantics. So Frege maintained that it wasn't just singular terms like proper names or individual words that had senses, but that declarative sentences also had a sense or also expressed a sense. Now, Frege called the sense expressed by declarative sentences a thought. This was like his technical term. But as I mentioned in the last video, senses are not supposed to be things like ideas or concepts in the mind. So for Frege, a thought is not a concept or an idea in the mind. A thought is an abstract entity. It exists outside of space and time, and it is not mentally dependent or is not dependent on any particular person's mental states. Nevertheless, Frege decided to use the word thought to refer to the sense or the content of declarative sentences. So rather than using this term, I instead prefer to use the term Fregean propositions. So we won't refer to the senses of declarative sentences as thoughts, the way that Frege does. Instead, we will refer to them as Fregean propositions. This way we don't get confused about the fact that the content or the sense of declarative sentences are not supposed to be mind dependent or mental objects. So, like Russellian propositions, Fregean propositions are also structured or complex entities. All right. The way that the sense of a declarative sentence is determined following the principle of compositionality is going to be on the basis of the senses of the individual linguistic terms in the sentence itself, right? So take the sentence, Aristotle is human, right? Under the simple theory, the proposition expressed by Aristotle as human would be the complex Russellian proposition in which Aristotle himself was a constituent of the proposition as well as the property being human. However, under the Fregean picture, the Fregean proposition that is expressed by the sentence Aristotle is human is going to be the complex entity whose constituents are the sense of whatever Aristotle is. So whatever the sense of that is, that's going to be the constituent, and whatever the sense of being human is. So Fregean propositions, again, are going to be complex or structured entities whose constituents are just senses. That's what they are. They don't have objects or properties in the way we were thinking about them before. They have senses, the senses expressed by these individual expressions. In addition, like other linguistic expressions that have both a sense and a reference, declarative sentences under the Fregean picture also have a sense, which is a Fregean proposition, and a referent. So what is the referent of a declarative sentence? Well, according to Frege, the referent of a declarative sentence is going to be a truth value or its truth value. So for example, take the sentence Aristotle is human. Well, we already know what the proposition or sense of Aristotle as human is. That's this structured proposition. And since Aristotle is human, then that sentence, the referent of that sentence is the truth or true. Now, before we look at how Frege solves the puzzle of propositional attitude reports, it is important to understand the following distinctions that Frege makes between customary reference, indirect reference, customary sense, and indirect sense. So the customary reference of a individual term, say a proper name like Aristotle, is just what it is. It's just Aristotle himself, right? The customary sense of an expression like Aristotle is going to be the sense that is associated with the name Aristotle. So the sense that would be expressed with the definite description or the description, the teacher of Alexander the Great. The distinction between customary reference and customary sense, I think, should be simple enough because it's just the main distinction we made between sense and reference when we originally introduced these concepts in the first video. So now let's move on to the indirect sense of an expression. So we already know kind of more or less what the normal sense of an expression is. So let's take the name Hector or Aristotle, right? The sense of Aristotle is the sense that would be expressed with the description, the teacher of Alexander the Great, right? Now, if we take the name Aristotle and we embed that linguistic term inside of another linguistic term so that we are now no longer using the name Aristotle the way we would normally use it, right? Say to talk about an individual, but now we are using the word Aristotle to talk about the word Aristotle itself. Now that expression becomes a different expression, right? And that expression has the name Aristotle within that expression has a completely different sense. Suppose that E is Aristotle, right? So now we know what the sense of Aristotle is. But now let's say that we use that name, that linguistic term, Aristotle, and we want to not use it, but talk about it. So like, for instance, if somebody's wondering how many letters does the word Aristotle have, right? Well, that sentence, how many letters does the word Aristotle have, right? That linguistic expression is going to have a completely different sense, or I should say, the word or name Aristotle within that expression is going to convey a different sense. So what the indirect sense of an expression is would be the sense of an expression of the following kind, where we are now talking about the actual expression itself and not actually using it, right? So there's a difference between using an expression and talking about an expression. So I can use the expression Aristotle to say something about Aristotle. If I were teaching a class in ancient philosophy, I would say things like Aristotle wrote the Nicomachean Ethics, right? Not right there, I'm using the word Aristotle, but I can also mention the word Aristotle by saying, Aristotle has these many letters, or Aristotle starts with an A, right? There I'm no longer using the word Aristotle to talk about somebody, but I'm now mentioning the word to say something about the linguistic expression itself. Now, finally, indirect reference. So what most scholars seem to agree on is that what Frege means by indirect reference is just the customary sense of an expression. So the indirect reference of an expression is just the sense of the expression. And we'll see, actually, this is going to be the key for how Frege solves the propositional attitude report puzzle. We'll see how this works. So it's important to maintain that, to understand that if you understand what the customary sense of a linguistic expression is, right, then just kind of transfer that over to your understanding of indirect reference. This is a little bit more technical, and we'll see in a little bit how that works. But essentially, the indirect reference of a linguistic expression is just its customary sense in any other context. It's just that it helps us solve the puzzle of propositional attitude reports by making this distinction, and we'll see how that works. So if we recall from the last video, it seems that it's possible that sentence number 1 be true, but sentence number 2 be false. Well, how is this the case if, all of these terms seem to refer to the same thing, right? John refers to John, believes refers to the relation of believing, Mark Twain and Sam Clemens refer to the same individual, wrote refers to the act of writing, and so on and so forth, right? Huck Finn refers to the same piece of work, Huck Finn. So how is it they can vary in truth value when all of these terms seem to refer to the same thing? Well, the reason for this is because what we have here is a propositional attitude report. In other words, what we are saying of John in both of these sentences is that John believes a particular proposition. The proposition that, so in sentence number 1, the proposition that Mark Twain wrote Huck Finn, and sentence number 2, the proposition that Samuel Clemens wrote Huck Finn. Now, if we recall, under the simple theory, the proposition Mark Twain wrote Huck Finn and the proposition Sam Clemens wrote Huck Finn turn out to be the exact same propositions. So this is a bit problematic because if they're the same proposition, then they mean the exact same thing and they should have the same truth values. But Frege is saying, hold on, that makes no sense. Something has gone wrong here, right? So the way that Frege goes about solving this problem is by suggesting the following. Whenever we use a proper name like Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens, within the context of an attitude verb. So an attitude verb is a thing like believing, knowing, hoping, right? So we can say John believes, John knows, John hopes, so on. Whenever we use a name within the context of an attitude report, like in the case of Mark Twain or Sam Clemens, the name no longer has its customary reference. So in other words, the reference of Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens within these contexts are not the individual Samuel Clemens, right? The person that they refer to, but instead what they refer to is the sense of Mark Twain and the sense of Sam Clemens, right? And these have different senses. Mark Twain has a different sense than Samuel Clemens. Now, this sense within these contexts is what Frege calls the indirect reference, right? We said that the customary sense and the indirect reference are the same thing for Frege, right? So the way that he goes about solving this problem is by saying, look, names work differently, semantically differently, within the context of attitude reports. When we ascribe an attitude, like believing or knowing or hoping, to an individual, right? And that thing that we're ascribing to, that proposition, if it has a name, that name no longer has its customary reference. Now it has its indirect reference, and an indirect reference is a sense. And the name Mark Twain and the name Sam Clemens have different senses. This is why it's possible for sentence number 1 to come out as true, while sentence number 2 come out as false. And this is also why it's possible for sentence number 1 and 2 to differ in cognitive significance, even though the names John refer to the same individual, the verbs believes refers to the same property, the names Mark Twain and Sam Clemens refer to the same person, and so on and so forth. Even though all of the references of these things appear to be the same, it's still possible, or at least intuitively, it is the case that they differ in some kind of meaning or in cognitive significance. So this is how Frege appears to have solved the problem of propositional attitudes reports by using his distinction of sense and reference, and also by making further distinctions between customary reference, indirect reference, customary sense, and indirect sense. So that concludes this video. If you have any questions, please let me know.